Number 10. Secret Agent Matt. What if Daredevil never became Daredevil at all, but instead Matt Murdock became an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D.? That's the story told in this What If issue we get from Volume 1 of the series in issue 28. Here we get to see an alternate reality where Daredevil never even became Daredevil. Tony Stark happened to be the one responsible for the accident that blinded young Matt, as it was his truck filled with toxic chemicals that was driving through the city when Matt had his fateful accident. When he learned of what happened, he decided to turn over Matt to S.H.I.E.L.D., hoping that they could help him. Nick Fury saw great potential in Matt Murdock and trained him to become a secret agent for S.H.I.E.L.D. Matt goes on a mission to rescue his dad, who is kidnapped by Hydra, and in the end joins up with the S.H.I.E.L.D. team. Number 9. House of M. Although Daredevil wasn't one of the main players in the House of M storyline, an alternate reality created by Scarlet Witch, he still existed in this reality. Here Matt Murdock was still a lawyer and was even lucky enough to tangle with She-Hulk. Despite the fact that he and She-Hulk are both lawyers, they don't really team up a lot in the main continuity, nor are they a couple. But in House of M issue number 3, we learn of a rumor floating around the Jade Giantess She-Hulk that she has the hots for Matt, and that both lawyers have been seen canoodling in and around the courthouse. What a scandal. And friends, before I move on to this next spot, if you are loving this list and you want more good Top 10 Nerd content, you need to check out our newest channel, Top 10 Nerd Elite. Go on over there, hit that subscribe, go to a video and type a little comment and be like, hey Amanda, I'm here, I did it. Number 8. Dare the Terminator. Dare the Terminator comes to us from the Amalgam Universe and is a combined version of both Marvel's Daredevil and DC's Deathstroke the Terminator. A strange but cool fact about Dare is that she's a woman, despite the fact that both the characters that were amalgamated together to create her in this universe are male. Dare, however, also received her name from the fact that she is a fearless Daredevil who few dare to challenge. She had horns surgically grafted onto her head by enemy the Big Question, aka Enigma Fisk, and she is also missing an eye. Kinda got like, of course she's an Amalgam character, so she's got a little bit of both things going on there. Number 7. Moondragon. Yeah, this was a weird one. A brief one, but a weird one. Daredevil and Moondragon had a brief infatuation with one another in Daredevil issue 108. After he leaves Natasha, Black Widow, who also has the hots for him, she mourns the loss of Matt, knowing that he has eyes for Moondragon. What? Okay, so even if we ignore the fact that Moondragon is usually presented later as being a gay character in the comics, this is still a really weird ship. The two are described as being inexplicably drawn to one another, but ultimately decide to go their separate ways because they are galaxies apart. Well, literally. I also love that Moondragon originally explains that they can't be together because of their respective orientations toward life in the cosmos. Apparently. They also, I believe, one time like psychically mind melded, which is pretty sexy for Moondragon, I think. She's like, let me get into that beautiful, brilliant mind. Number 6. Belasco. On Earth X, there are actually a few different versions of Daredevil. Most people probably think of the actual character who appears severely depressed and to kind of crave his own death, who goes by the name Daredevil, but there are actually a few others besides. One version is also an alternate of Nightcrawler, Kurt Wagner. This alternate version of the character ends up becoming Belasco, but later settles down in Hell's Kitchen, choosing to operate as a hero for a time and protecting that neighborhood. So he's literally a red devil of a demon man running around Hell's Kitchen, acting as its guardian. A pretty cool Earth 9997 visual reference or alternate to Earth 616's DD. Number 5. Depression. While the revelation of his mother's fate and the death of his father was hard, something else that Matt would inherit would also prove challenging for most of his life. That was Matt's own depression. Like his mother before him, Matt has also struggled with his own emotions and mental health throughout much of his life. We later learn that the struggle of depression is also seemingly Matt's everyday. Depression isn't something that he can really escape, but the silver lining is, although he's felt the weight of it, he's also learned how to cope with it. Not necessarily recovering from it fully, but definitely finding a way to live life with his depression and at times kind of move through it, refusing to let it overwhelm him, even at times when, based on what was going on, this likely seemed or felt impossible for him. As a result, Daredevil as a hero likely possesses some of the strongest willpower throughout Marvel's characters. I think it goes like Doom and then Daredevil, with maybe one or two people in between them. I feel like if you're depressed every day, you're constantly struggling and being a superhero and dealing with all of the other, stuff in life, that's pretty impressive. You gotta have a strong will. Number 4. 1602. The 1602 version of Matt Murdock is kinda weird in the sense that he became blind and received his powers from venturing into a cave and eating green, glowing goop that he found there. The whole point of this version of the story is to show how fearless of a character Matt was, but still, it's pretty weird, even given how fearless he was, that he'd ingest mysterious glowing green goo. That sounds like it could be slightly crossing the line from fearless to just plain stupid territory. Of course, sometimes those two traits do go hand in hand, so fair, I guess. Needless to say, it all worked out in the end, as that is where 1602's Matthew Murdock, also known as Sir Devil or the Bard, got his powers from. Oh yes, instead of living in his civilian life as a lawyer, Matthew here poses as a blind balladeer, a singer, but in secret operates as an expensive adventurer for hire or a bodyguard. Number 3. Heather Glenn. Heather Glenn is another weird partner for Daredevil in that her story was also deeply tragic. I guess this is becoming no longer weird since everybody's story is deeply tragic. She was a beneficiary of his, a wealthy socialite that he ended up dating. In his Daredevil guise, he ended up saving her father from Purple Man, Kilgrave, who had been controlling him. However, her father was so distraught when he found out all that the Purple Man had made him do that he still took his own life while he was in prison. In the end, his daughter would follow suit. She blamed Daredevil for her father's death and attempted to betray his secret identity multiple times to get back at him. Still, somehow, Matt got past that and Heather got past her own hatred of DD, and the two ended up engaged. In the end, however, Heather took her own life, hanging herself after she became distraught when criminals destroyed her business, which, of course, she also blamed Daredevil for, and which he once again may have deserved that blame. Maybe. Number 2. Earth 666. On Earth 666, Daredevil is a literal devil who dares to join the other undead heroes to assemble as the Avengers of the Undead. We don't know much about this alternate version as he's only made an appearance in a few issues, but we can assume his abilities are similar to his 616 counterpart, with one of the major differences from 616 DD being that he actually appears to be a real red devil with giant horns coming out of his head. You can catch this alternate version of the hero in the 2010 Secret Avengers series in issues 33 to 36. Number 1. Daredevil. He's a deer devil. Daredevil was only briefly mentioned by Peter Porker and hails from his reality of Earth 25. What's so strange about this alternate version of Matt? You guessed it, he's a deer, hence the name Daredevil. Daredevil's civilian name here is actually also different from the 616 counterpart, and it is Bat Burdock, and he made his first appearance in the Spider-Ham 25th anniversary special from June of 2010. Daredevil was one of the heroes who Peter Porker got to know along the way as he transitioned from just being a regular young pig to the hero Spider-Ham. As Peter Porker reminisces on his past, we see Daredevil's head among the other characters that Spider-Ham has encountered within his past. Number 10. Abandoned by Stick. Really, Matt's story, as you're going to find out, is all about loss, tragedy, and grief. While there's a lot of ups for Matt Murdock, there's also been a lot of downs. One such high he rode was being trained by his master Stick, who began training him after the accident where he lost his sight, but had all other senses heightened as a result. However, shortly after his father's death, Stick too would leave Matt, and at a time when Matt really needed him too. Matt had tracked down the last man involved in his father's death. A masked Matt attacked him but found himself overwhelmed by the women who worked there, who seemed to take out all their worldly rage on him, attacking him in kind. In the scuffle, he accidentally pushed one of them with enough force to send her crashing and falling out of a window. She would live, but the incident would awaken other personas living deep within her. This woman would become Daredevil's villain and sometimes love interest, Typhoid Mary. Matt at the time, however, believed he'd killed the woman and ran back to the gym in search of Stick. But Stick was gone. He had abandoned Matt because of what he'd done. Ouch. Sucks. Number 9. Getting involved with Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary wasn't just a person that Daredevil hurt, she'd also become a recurring love interest of his, on and off. And honestly, the moment where he accidentally pushed her out of a window could be considered one of the worst moments of his life, for how much grief Typhoid Mary would cause in his life both as an enemy and as a lover. Typhoid Mary suffers from a dissociative personality disorder, meaning she has personalities that reside within her that are more calm or sweet, but then there are of course also sides to her that are more violent or deadly, and each one is literally their own personality, separate from the other. Typically, the persona of Mary is her sweeter side, Typhoid Mary is her more villainous one, and Bloody Mary is probably the most violent, hate-filled, and unhinged personality of hers. However, it should be noted that while Typhoid Mary is one of the worst people to get involved with Matt, he was also likely one of the worst things in her adult life, at least, to have happened to her, with him re-triggering her split personalities to resurface. Although it wasn't him initially that caused the split, at least. That was trauma from her past. Some really intense trauma, to be real about that. And friends, before I move on to this next spot, if you are loving this list and you want more Daredevil lists, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Number 8. His mother's fate. Not the fact that she became a nun, but more what caused her to leave her family. Later on, we would learn that Matt's mom, Maggie, had abandoned her children due to experiencing severe depression following their birth. As a result of her depression, she also became obsessed with Matt's safety and paranoid that her husband was plotting against her. One night, she became so distraught and confused by her depression that she tried to do harm to young Matt. Jack stopped her, but Maggie was overwhelmed with fear. Terrified, she felt the best course of action was to leave her family so she couldn't do any harm to any of them. She left, became a nun, and even after she recovered from her mental illness, did not return, leaving Matt to grow up without his mother, led to believe by his father that his mother had died when he was very young. Matt would not learn until much later in his life what had really happened to her. Number 7. Daredevil 2099. This alternate version of Matt Murdock's character comes to us from one of the 2099 universes. Sam Fisk in the future is the heir to the Kingpin legacy, but finds himself struggling with guilt surrounding that legacy. To counterbalance all the bad his grandfather has wrought, Samuel Fisk decides to become the new Daredevil in the future, becoming our Daredevil 2099 over 2992. Kind of weird to think that in the great Marvel multiverse, there is a reality where it is Wilson Fisk's ancestor and not Matt's that becomes the new Daredevil. But this weird fact is also what makes Samuel Fisk so interesting as DD as well. Number 6. Secret identity exposed. One of the worst things to have happened to Matt multiple times really at this point is having his identity revealed. There are a few instances where this happened prior to Kingpin even learning of his identity through information that Matt's ex at the time, Karen Page, sold him, but I would still say that the reveal to Kingpin was still probably one of the worst. Also, to be clear, Karen Page I don't think explicitly sold that information to Kingpin. She sold the information and then it ended up in Kingpin's hands. Kingpin used the information that he got to make Matt's life a living hell, ruining his civilian life, leaving Matt destitute, with even his reputation as Daredevil and even his costume left in shambles. It really was a rough time just all around. Number 5. Karen Page. Karen Page has to have one of the most tragic stories out of all of Daredevil's love interests. One of, anyways, because as I said earlier, there's a lot of tragedy here. Karen and Matt had an on and off again romance that eventually resulted in Karen's death at the hands of Bullseye. Surprise, surprise. Karen betrayed Matt by selling out his secret identity due to a drug addiction. However, she did return to warn him afterward. In the end, Matt and Karen came back together despite the revelation that she had been the one to sell out his secret identity in this case and had betrayed him. She got clean and the two of them got back together. They would later break up again and get back together a few more times, with Karen even forgiving Daredevil for faking his death and helping him when he had a crisis where split personalities appeared to emerge, which kind of makes sense given his dating history, but we'll get to that later. They had the most rocky romance likely in comic book history overall, and Karen actually gave her life to save Daredevil. But also she went through some crazy stuff, I feel like, because of Daredevil. Poor Karen Page, RIP. Number 4. Shadowland. The Shadowland story was really brutal for Matt Murdock and also for readers and fans. DD ended up becoming the leader of the Hand, but it would later be revealed that he was actually not in control of himself during this time, as he was possessed by the Beast of the Hand, a demonic entity. Daredevil did a lot of awful things during this time, including killing Bullseye, building a mighty fortress known as Shadowland, and attempting to kill BFF Foggy. No, not Foggy. All in all, the whole event was a rough go for Daredevil, and by the end of it, he was forced to leave Hell's Kitchen and go on a journey of self-discovery, as he tried to find his way back to his initially heroic path. Shadowland was rough overall. It's a rough time in Daredevil's story. Number 3. Kingpin. Never mind a reality where Daredevil works for Kingpin, how about a reality where Matt Murdock never becomes Daredevil and instead becomes a deadly assassin working for the Hand, who eventually rises in their ranks and, seeking more power, works for Kingpin, eventually taking the title for himself as he builds his own crime syndicate. That is exactly what happens on Earth 65, where Matt Murdock is more criminal than anything. He started out down the path of a hero, but after Stick, who took him under his wing, was killed, he fell into the hands, or hand really, of the Hand. This set him down a dark path towards villainy as he became more and more obsessed with power. Number 2. Death of ELEKTRA. While she may have been returned to life later on, the death of ELEKTRA, Matt's first love, still hit him hard. The two hadn't been together for some time, but had dated back in college before ELEKTRA mysteriously disappeared. She resurfaced years later and was revealed to be an assassin, competing to become the Kingpin's #1 hitman. Or hit woman, perhaps. Unfortunately, she was up against Bullseye, who decided to kill off his competition. He and ELEKTRA had a dramatic fight that ended with an iconic panel showing her being stabbed through with her own sai by Bullseye, but only after he had already seemingly cut her throat by throwing a playing card at her, so don't forget that part. While ELEKTRA and Daredevil weren't together at the time of her death, her fate at the hands of Bullseye still haunted Matt, and he probably still thinks back to that moment and is like, even though ELEKTRA is alive now. Number 1. Death of Karen Page. Yeah, Daredevil loses a lot of people that he cares about. Honestly, it's no wonder he struggles with depression, considering just how much loss he suffered in his life. I mean, that's gotta be really hard. Karen Page was another close person who became a victim and a target as a result of being so close to Matt, aka Daredevil. For many years, she was Daredevil's confidant, his on and off again girlfriend who knew of his secret identity. In fact, I believe Karen Page was one of the first people, don't quote me on this, but I think she was one of the first people to actually find out about Matt's secret identity as Daredevil, so yeah. Eventually, her closeness to Matt put her on a very dangerous collision course with one of his arch nemeses, Bullseye. As Bullseye, who pretty much never misses, targeted Daredevil with his own billy club, Karen jumped in front of the projectile to save Matt, and in so doing was killed as the billy club penetrated her heart. Number 10. Candace Nelson. That time when Daredevil very briefly dated Foggy Nelson's sister. Oh yeah, Foggy has a sister. Apparently, this happened so quickly it's basically the smallest blip on Daredevil's love line, I'm sure, when it comes to Palm ratings. Candace is Foggy Nelson's younger sister who is studying journalism at ESU and ended up doing some snooping and attempted to expose the government and university for some involvement in some super shady activity. She and Foggy have always been at odds because she sees him as the way too stiff establishment type, and he sees her as the rebel who thinks that she's above the law. In the end, she and Daredevil had a bit of a thing at a time when Daredevil was pretty much wanted by every woman who appeared in his comic, including Natasha Romanoff, Black Widow. Oh, and after years of being friends with Foggy, Matt didn't even know that he had a sister till we got past the 100th issue of Daredevil, which is pretty weird. It's also implied later on that she is way too young for Matt. Also, her face is something else in that whole issue where that comes up. She's like, "I missed you," and I'm like, what's going on? You look crazy, Candace. Number 9. ELEKTRA. While ELEKTRA may be one of Daredevil's greatest loves, it doesn't mean she can't be one of the strangest as well. It all boils down to the fact that ELEKTRA is a really intense anti-hero when she's not busy being a villain. She's an assassin who has zero qualms with killing anyone in her way, which makes those two a kind of strange match. However, their costumes match really well, which is likely meant to symbolize some of the similarities that these two have. They are both intensely skilled fighters with a lot of darkness in their past and their present, to be honest. Their present. Well, yeah, because ELEKTRA did come back to life, so it did happen. She has a present, even though she did. However, ELEKTRA kind of paved the way for all the death and destruction, it seems, that dating Daredevil seems to bring to most of his partners. So there's also that. Number 8. Becky Blake. This is a pretty weird one, mostly just because it seems like Becky Blake and Matt's relationship is a very one-sided and has always remained that way, and yet Becky never gives up. But also because Becky is another character who has just suffered a lot of trauma and tragedy, some of which was caused by Matt Murdock himself, and some of which was not. While many people might know Karen Page as the sole secretary for Nelson and Murdock, after there was Karen, there was Becky. Becky herself lost the use of her legs after suffering an attack by Michael Reese, who Murdock would later bring to justice. Becky would consistently express her feelings for Matt, who seemed conflicted before deciding he wasn't interested. Maybe it was his relationship with Karen, which was also a huge mess, that ultimately affected his decision. Either way, Karen remained a friend to Matt for a long time despite all the crazy stuff he put her through. In fact, she even also became a lawyer and joined their firm for a while. Eventually, however, she chose to firmly distance herself from both Matt and Foggy after having a near-death experience and felt that Matt Murdock was no longer worthy of her trust. And she was like desperate for him for so long, and I'm just like, wow, that one thing though, she's like, and that's it. I was super into you, but I can't anymore. Number 7. The death of his father. Let's go back to Daredevil's origins. Right off the bat, life was pretty tough for Matt, starting out as a hero. His dad was Jack Murdock, who was a boxer, and always had dreamed of a better life for his son. And while Matt would go on to have a pretty good life, becoming a lawyer, Jack wouldn't be around to see it. Jack Murdock was killed after he refused to take a dive in a rigged boxing match. The fixer, Roscoe Sweeney, had been the one to order the hit, as he was the boxing organizer who worked with Jack and had ordered him to throw that match. Daredevil would pursue the fixer, attempting to get revenge for his father's death, but Sweeney would die of a heart attack during the chase. Number 6. Dakota North. I mean, this one made sense in terms of how it kind of came about, and it wasn't a full-on romance specifically, but these two did hook up. It all went down after Matt had suffered a pretty big loss and was still technically married. After the hookup, the not so great part was that pictures of these two doing the deed were circulated, because Kingpin is obsessed in every way possible you can imagine with Daredevil. They ended up on the front page of all the newspapers, which was super awkward for both Dakota and Matt, and also for a time cost Dakota North pretty unfairly, if I might add, her reputation. Matt came out mostly unscathed though in comparison, although there was definitely a cost for him as well when it came to these pictures. The images made everything super weird between the two going forward. And kind of awkward for I think a lot of people in that comic. There were a lot of people that were like, ah, what's happening? Number 5. Exiles. The alternate Daredevil of Earth 181 is a version we see in the Exiles. Any reality where Daredevil serves the Kingpin to me is weird, which is why this version makes our cut. After serving on the Weapon X team at the behest of the Timebreakers, this version was held captive in a crystal palace, instead of being sent home as promised. However, when he did return home, we learned that Daredevil on Earth 181 is a brutalizer who works for the Kingpin and seems to genuinely enjoy violently attacking his targets. Number 4. MILLA Donovan. There are fates worse than death, and that seems to be what MILLA Donovan got when it comes to her relationship with Daredevil. She was driven insane by Mr. Fear, who had been targeting her for months and posing as her therapist after she ended up marrying Matt Murdock. She was driven insane, killed someone as a result, and ended up being locked away for her own good when private care also wasn't working for her. In the end, her husband Matt was denied visitation rights while MILLA was in treatment, as it was believed that he was actually the cause of all of her problems. Yikes. Her parents attempted to get custody of MILLA again after they learned of everything that had happened to their daughter and blamed Matt, which is, is kind of fair, to be honest. In the end, Matt agreed to their request after pictures of him sleeping with Dakota North surfaced. Overall, he was just going through a lot and he needed a shoulder to cry on, which ended up turning into a weird relationship with Dakota, which we talked about earlier. Matt had been attempting to lobby to get MILLA freed from the mental institution, but in the end, he acknowledged that he just needed to let her go. Bullseye did attempt to kill her when she was made one of his targets, but fortunately, Daredevil had already predicted this play and had Black Widow on standby to protect MILLA. All in all, this relationship became all kinds of messed up, and I'm still amazed that MILLA is alive today. And before we move on to our number 3 spot, just a quick little reminder to give this video a thumbs up if you can, if you will. It really does help us out here at the channel, and thank you for doing so. Number 3. Marriage to MILLA Donovan. So all in all, although Daredevil considered it in retrospect to be a mistake, I'm not trying to say that their whole marriage was awful, because that's not what happened. Matt and MILLA had some good moments, and there was a time that they were both happy together. But ultimately, their marriage ended up causing them both a lot of pain in the end overall. At one point, MILLA herself didn't even believe that their marriage was ever real, convinced that Matt had manipulated and lied to her. She filed for an annulment, and it hurt Matt to receive the request and even have to consider that. However, Matt and MILLA would make it past this and eventually end up back together, seemingly happy for a time. But her worry over Matt's safety would cause her to seek out the help of a therapist, who was secretly Mr. Fear in disguise. Oh goodness. Instead of helping MILLA, Mr. Fear actually only made things worse for her, causing her to become more fearful and paranoid. Eventually, MILLA did enough harm that she was arrested and considered criminally insane after she accidentally pushed someone into the path of a speeding train. Don't think MILLA has ever recovered from all of that terrible stuff that happened to her, alas. At least she's still alive, I guess? As we move on to the next points. Number 2. Black Cat. This is a pretty random one. Black Cat isn't someone you'd associate with Daredevil, mostly because she is usually so obsessed with Spider-Man that everyone she has ever been with outside of Peter Parker tends to have to do with some kind of play of getting back at him or something to do with Peter himself. For Black Cat, it's usually all about Spider-Man. So, how did this come about? Well, it all went down when Spider-Man recruited Daredevil to help him free Black Cat from prison. But while they were developing a legal strategy, Black Cat herself escaped and the two of them had to track her down. It was during this time that Daredevil developed an attraction to Black Cat and she to him. Although for Black Cat, there still really only seems to be one true superhero for her, as both she and Daredevil admitted that their relationship was more of a fun physical thing than anything serious. Although I guess I'm not super surprised that they're attracted to each other because they're both like hotties, but I'm also just like, this is like a random thing that someone was like, what if they got together? Everyone's like, I mean, I guess why not? Number 1. Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary has got to be one of the strangest pairings for Matt, especially considering he was the one that caused all the grief in her life after he knocked her out of a window. True story. This trauma brought forth from Mary 3 split personalities, at least 3, which are later kind of explained as being part of past trauma, but were kind of just triggered into resurfacing by Matt's accidental influence. By his accidental violence, really. Still, you can pretty much blame Matt for creating the villain that became Typhoid Mary. One of these personalities was that villain, another was hypersexual, and the third was much more modest in comparison to the other two. I guess the most normal of all 3 personalities, really. These are the most commonly acknowledged personalities, but she also appears to have other lesser utilized personalities when it comes to the comics, such as Mutant Zero. Daredevil for a time was involved with all 3 of her main personalities, but it gets weirder. A frequent ally of the Kingpin, Mary has also attempted to kill Matt multiple times. Oh, and while she is a mutant, she only seems to be able to access her mutant abilities through certain personalities. Weird.